Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next conversation. I don't even know how many there have been of the Agile Insights conversation series. Today, I'm accompanied by a dear friend and former colleague, Melissa Boggs. Melissa will introduce herself shortly. And Melissa and I are going to talk about a bunch of topics that are close to my heart. And some of those things she and I have gone through together. And this will be a good reflection for the two of us, which I think is also going to be helpful for many people that are either in those positions or are going to be in those positions. But before we get there, Melissa, welcome to the show. And quickly introduce yourself to our audience. Some of them might not know you, and then we dive right into the topics. Your stage, Melissa.
Hi. Hey, everyone. My name is Melissa Boggs. I am a keynote speaker and a leadership coach, and I work with modern progressive organizations who want to be really human centric and agile.
Yeah. And Melissa, you have done a bunch of things in the past. I was not going to say in your past because that would sound like you're very old. You're very experienced. But there are four things that I want to talk to you about based on the experience that you have. The first one is you became a coach over many years of training. You worked as a coach extensively, and then you decided to basically switch sides and move into a CEO position. And by sides, I don't mean it in any way bad, but it's a very different job, right? So I
Mhm.
want to talk to you about that transition, becoming a CEO, and how your coaching path supported you, and what kind of assumptions maybe or things that you had trained as a coach you also had to let go. I'm curious to find out. The second piece is you not only became a CEO during your stay with the Scrum Alliance, you were a co CEO, which brings its own challenges, but also probably benefits. And I would like to explore that with you because we don't have that many people who have actually been in a co CEO role. And even if it's not co CEOs, maybe people can take inspiration for co leadership roles, be it women or men, doesn't really matter. There are a lot of people that are interested in sharing a leadership position, and maybe they can benefit from the experiences and the insights that you have had during your time being a co CEO. The third point that I want to talk to you about is about dealing with a board of directors, right? Dealing with a sounding board. Your initial reaction maybe shows that like it's not all interesting and good, but I'm sure there have been certain things that were beneficial, but also certain things where like, oh man, that was really bad. And that made our lives so much more difficult, both yours, probably your co CEOs, but also the overall organization. And as a disclaimer, I was part of that board of directors when Melissa joined back then the Scrum Alliance as one of the co CEOs. And the
That's
final
the
thing,
reaction, Sohrab.
pardon?
Sorry. That's the reaction,
That's the
Sohrab.
reaction. Yeah, yeah. And the final thing is you basically left the organization and moved back into coaching. And I would like to understand, similar to how coaching was beneficial to you getting into the CEO role, how being in that CEO role probably was beneficial to you moving back into coaching. So those are the four topics I try to follow more or less closely when we go through this conversation, but I also want to leave enough room for us to explore other areas or other things. Every time you and I speak, it's always interesting and I learn a ton, and I hope you too. And therefore, I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. So let's start with the first one. I think it was 2019 or 20 at the end of 2018. Yeah, we had this interview with you, and ultimately the board of directors decided to bring you in, initially called as the chief scrum master of the organization, which then ultimately became a co CEO role. And share with me, you were a coach before that. With what kind of a mindset did you get into this job of the chief scrum master slash co CEO? And which of those assumptions turned out to be correct? And where did you have to learn new stuff?
Great question. I actually want to go back to the interview for just a second because I think it sets up the whole experience really well. And I have such warm fuzzies about the way that the board received a very deliberate decision that I made. When I came to that interview, for the first time in my adult life, I made a very deliberate decision to be myself. Um, as you said, I was a coach. I was an agile coach. We are full of post-it notes and Sharpies and games and, you know, things that are very intentional to bring out the realness in people and the realness in a team. And I knew that if I was going to, help lead this company, that that's how I was going to lead. And like I said, I would say this was the first time that I did not go into an interview and just tell them what they wanted to hear. Rather, I said, I'm going to be who I am. I'm going to present the way I present. That way, I know that if they choose me, this board is getting what they expected. They don't get some like buttoned up person that I am not in the interview. And then like I show up, in a superwoman dress on my first day or something. And so that's what I did. And frankly, it was terrifying because we've all been trained how to come to interviews and answer the question properly and, tell people what they want to hear so that they get the job. Instead, I showed up and made the entire board of directors do a rock, paper, scissors tournament. That was the very
I
first thing
remember
that we
that
did
one,
in
yeah.
this interview. And part of it was because we were in this really stuffy, small conference room, and I wasn't their first interview, and I sort of wanted to shake up the energy in the room, which is exactly what I would do, with the team as Scrum Alliance or with the board of directors in a meeting. And so I was so pleasantly surprised. I mean, there were definitely some like confused looks at first, but it was received really well. And went on to, give my presentation, and we did some post-it notes and Sharpies in the interview. Um, but it boded well for me that this group of people who were going to be my boss if I got this job, didn't refuse to stand up and play rock, paper, scissors, because that was such a huge part of who we are as a movement. That if we couldn't show up that way, if I couldn't show up that way, then frankly, I didn't want the job. Um, so I start there because I think that really gave me a confidence that the skills I had as a coach, as an agile coach, as a member of this community were actually the things that the board wanted to see in this role as I stepped into it. And I'm not even sure I could have approached the things that I did, A, without that experience, but also B, without the confidence that that's what the board wanted. And they never let me down, frankly, when it came to that type of thing. I know we're going to talk about the board in a minute, but these things are kind of interwoven. Like every time that I brought my experience to the table or my perception to the table based on my experience and said to the board, I think this is a change that we need to make, you supported me. Asked tough questions for sure, but trusted that experience that I had. And I will always be grateful for that because that was some of my best work so far in my career. And I would not have been able to do it if I hadn't been trusted.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the tournament. I think I won. I'm not sure though.
Not. I actually remember who won, and it was not you, but you were.
Okay. I'm saying I'm not sure though.
So, you asked, one of your questions was, what did I bring into that mindset? And because my role was chief scrum master and I had been a scrum master and an agile coach for my career, I mean, that's what I brought. And again, I was just grateful that there was confirmation that that's actually what was wanted. Otherwise, it would have been harder to keep introducing things and having them, not accepted or received well.
So you come in as a chief scrum master initially. It turns out to be very quickly a co-CEO role. Which of the skills that you had as a coach did you rely on most? And where were areas where you realized, hey, I do have a gap here? And that's what I need to close in terms of to be really excel in my new role as a co-CEO.
It's probably a pretty obvious answer, but, as it related to our team and organizational development and our structure and our culture, those things came pretty naturally to me. I mean, there were definitely moments where we had to think differently and be more creative, but those were things that I had thought about, talked about for years. I mean, and I had been in like higher level roles in other organizations as well. I had been at a director level previously. So there were things like budgets that I was already familiar with, but this was definitely at a different scale. I mean, I would say that the biggest thing that I didn't have previous experience in was working with the board as a CEO. I had actually been on a board before. I was on the board of Agile Denver. Um, but being in that role where you're sort of bridging the gap between the staff and the board and trying to help both sides, and again, I don't mean that in an adversarial way, but both sides that are a little bit distant from one another, to understand each other and to understand that, we all have the same mission, we all have good intent. Um, so that part was new and fun, frankly. I actually really loved that part. And then I would say, while I had dealt with things like budgets before, and lawsuits, we got hit with the pandemic. I mean, exactly halfway through my tenure there. And so there were definitely moments where it wasn't just about a budget. It was, how do we manage the situation? How do we keep people safe? How do we keep people employed? How do we manage this like everyone else was dealing with? Um, and I don't know that anyone was prepared for that, but as someone who was first time in a CEO role, those were definitely new skills that I was having to develop on the spot.
Yeah. You mentioned that everything related to the teams, the structures of the organization, a lot of those things came natural to you because you had done a lot of thinking on those specific topics in the past. Now, as a coach, I'm sure you've had the opportunity to work with a few organizations on exactly those topics, but you never had the, and that's my assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, the accountability to also like follow those things through and see how the results turn out to be. And then also like being accountable towards both your teams and the board. Being now in that position where the whole weight is on your shoulders. Not only you can think about it conceptually, oh, we could do this and we could do this, and like all of the creative stuff that a lot of coaches do, including myself, but like really being responsible for that. How did that weigh on you?
So some people may have heard this story before, because I actually have a talk called "From Coach to CEO and Back." But I love telling this story because it was a pivotal moment, not just in my career, but in my life. So early on, we made a really big decision to really completely restructure the company in terms of organizational structure. And we were a couple days through what was basically a self-selection workshop where we had this overall structure of the team, and we were asking people to choose what work they wanted to do and what team they were going to be on. And this is something that I had, we had, you read about in books, you read about in reinventing organizations, or, you dream about doing as a coach. And we had a couple of coaches, amazing CECs that were along this journey with us. Um, and there was a moment on the second day out of three where there was just a lot of angst in the room. I mean, there was a lot of fear from the team, understandably so. What if I don't get the team that I want? I don't understand all of this. There's just a lot of change and a lot of fear. And I am a highly empathetic person. Um, and about lunchtime on that second day, we were taking a break, and I was in the room with a couple of the coaches. And I just want to say, like, all of them were well intentioned. All of them were doing exactly what they should have been doing and exactly what I would have done. But they were saying things like, okay, we just do this, we just do this. They were being reassuring, they were being encouraging. But I sat there and like literally had my head in my hands like this. It was like probably on the verge of tears. And I looked up and I said, with all due respect, guys, I love you, but this is a lot harder for me than it is for you. And in that moment, like it was almost like the world stopped because I realized that I had been on the other side of this moment that I was in many, many times and been like, okay, you just do this, you just do that. You're trying to be, you know, encouraging, and you don't have the weight of the world on your shoulders the way that that person does. I mean, there were times that I would go home during this process and be like, I have ruined everything. I have ruined everything. Obviously, I didn't. Um, but it was a pivotal moment because it wasn't, I mean, first of all, that I'll get into a little bit later, like how that changed the way that I view what I do now. But also, it was just sort of a moment about empathy. And I was like, how many times have I been in situations with a friend where I was like, oh, yeah, from the outside, it just looks like you do this. And it's like, yeah, but like they're the ones that deal with the results of whatever just doing that means,
Yeah.
and or bearing the emotional, um, I don't want to say burden, but like the emotional um, impact of the employees, right? Like they're looking at me going like, you did this to us. And I'm like, I did it for you. Let's see it through. So yeah, it was a really pivotal moment. And again, I can't stress enough, like, it's not that anything that those coaches were saying were wrong. Those folks were pillars for me during this entire journey, and I will always be grateful to them. But in that very specific moment, like I was alone, like I was in it and I was alone in it.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate to that. And as you mentioned, right, it's not about the coaches in that particular situation or any other situation not doing a good job. It's just that in some of these situations, no matter how much we say a leader should also have like coaching capabilities or act like a coach, it is fundamentally different having that responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When I used to work as a consultant, it was always easy. When things went south or wrong, you could tell, like, oh, the client just didn't do what we told them to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're so stupid. Like, if they had just done what we said they should do, everything would be nice. But when you, for the first time, have that responsibility to see things through, you weigh your decisions much more carefully. At least that's been my experience. And then B, you realize that between conceptualizing stuff and actually executing on them and then seeing how the things turn out, there's a big difference. And one of the pivotal moments, or many of those for me, has always been observing my dad as the CEO of my family's company, because he spent so much time and really like thought hard about every single decision to take about the company. And me, in many cases, being like this smart consultant from the other, say, why don't you just do that? And why don't you just do that? And he was like, when you at some point sit where I'm sitting, and he didn't mean that in any way like offensive or like looking down on me. He's like, I promise you, you'll weigh your decisions differently. And now, being the CEO of my own company for about 10 years, I totally get that. It's very, very different to be in that position in those particular situations. So now, a lot of the things that you had experienced before, learned before, practiced before were very helpful for you, especially filling that role of a chief scrum master, ultimately also co CEO. Now, let's dive into this co CEO and this shared leadership scenario that you were in with another one of our colleagues back then, Howard Sublet. What were the most important insights, not like saying good or bad, but really insights for you looking back at being in such a situation? And what kind of like tips and tricks would you give people that are going to be in a shared leadership position on a CEO level or any other level within an organization?
Well, I think it's important to point out that it wasn't just that we shared a role, because it was a combination of sharing a role and having two different roles, as weird as that sounds. We shared a role in the sense of sort of administrative, typical CEO stuff, but we were also chief scrum master and chief product owner. So we had very different lenses by which we had been asked to see the world. And I think what's interesting about that is that some of the things that we encountered, I think any scrum master and product owner would encounter, right? We all know that there is an inherent friction that's intended between a scrum master and a product owner. The product owner is really advocating for the product and for the customer, and the scrum master is really protecting and advocating for the team, and it creates a healthy conflict, in most cases, as long as you're aware of it and you don't personalize it about the other person. And I think that is one thing that we tried very hard to do, is recognize when it was the roles that were conflicting, not the people, not the humans.
Yeah.
We're not really arguing about, you know, our morality. It's that I have a job to do, you have a job to do, and we have a shared job to do. So I do think that's important, because it's interesting that it even shows up at that level, But if you were asked to look through a lens of scrum master or product owner, you're going to do your job. So that's one thing. I think it's really important in a relationship like that you do have coaching. Just like I believe that, marriages can have therapy even when there's nothing wrong,
Yeah.
to maintain the relationship and move it forward. Because especially, gosh, in the pandemic, when everyone is encountering things they have never seen before, you need someone to kind of, keep that healthy and keep that moving forward. Um, the other thing I would say is clarity of roles is paramount.
Mhm.
Um, Even though you share a role, you can't both be everywhere all the time. And so, what is the working agreement around, these are the things that I am focusing on, but here's how I'm going to communicate them with you, and vice versa. Um, because again, like, it makes no sense, when the board made that decision, I think we both knew that, it's not that we're expected to, like, show up everywhere all the time at the same time. The point is to sort of divide and conquer, so to speak, and apply your strengths to the right places, and to be aware and vulnerable when you don't have strengths in an area, and say, hey, this is not my area. Is this yours? If it's not, then one of us needs to learn it. But yeah, there's a lot of vulnerability involved for sure.
Mhm. So you mentioned the coaching piece. You mentioned working agreements, which can be supported by a coach. You mentioned the vulnerability piece, having the courage to also ask for help, right? Um, Now, one thing that I always find interesting, and this is not particularly about the two of you back then, but I think also it could be looked at that way, is alignment, right? For in your case, you mentioned you had separate roles, but you also had some shared responsibilities, a shared role. And whenever I think you have that shared role, especially looking at people that probably actually share a leadership position due to both being part time, just as one scenario, if you're not aligned, it becomes very difficult for everyone else involved. So the teams that you're leading, probably the whole organization, maybe the stakeholders that you're managing, etc. How did you aim for creating that alignment? And where do you think um, people need to look at very specifically and ensure that this alignment continues to exist?
I think that there was definitely a focus on alignment at the beginning, even with the board, not just between the two of us, but, we had a lot of conversations at the beginning about, what's the vision for this? And, um, how do we know if we're on the right track toward that vision? Um, we definitely made an effort to talk a lot. Even when one or the other of us was traveling, we had standing one-on-ones where we would, talk about what was going on, um, both tactically and strategically in the organization. Um, I think it's a slippery slope. Like, I really think it is a thing that is easy to get away from you. I hate to keep saying this, but it's not unlike a marriage. I mean, when you are sharing, you know, a role and that role has responsibility to other people, not
Kids.
infantilizing, yeah, like not
Mhm.
infantilizing employees by any stretch, but um, you have a responsibility to maintain that and to keep it up. But it is really easy to let that go in the busyness of every day. Just like in a marriage, my husband and I have been together for 20 years. If we don't pay attention to that, then we get really busy with all the kids' activities and whatnot. And suddenly we're finding ourselves like not fighting, not mad at each other, but like, oh, you said that? I said something else, And so it's not unlike that, where it takes constant maintenance to be able to maintain a level of alignment that not only keeps you sane, but everyone around you.
Yeah. And I think it becomes even more important when you think about a larger group of people. So now you're talking about two, right? The two co-CEOs or a couple in a marriage or whatever, right? Now, if you think about a whole team, let alone a whole organization that is building something collectively, the topic of alignment and the constant maintenance, I like that term that you used, to make sure that this alignment still exists, that takes a lot of the leader's effort in an organization. Now, did you, slightly moving off from the co CEO, now, did you see that as well with the rest of the organization? The importance of constantly creating that alignment with the people in the org, but also with the board?
Definitely. And I think with the people in the org, believe it or not, it was easier because they were there every day. And we put in, structures and rhythms to maintain that alignment. So, we had basically our organizational structure was that of persona based cross functional teams. And imagine that as, one team contains IT, education, um, marketing, like all different elements. Well, that means that they have to be aligned within that team, but everyone else who's also in that same craft, say marketing, also has to align to make sure that we all have one voice. So we had a structure of these teams, but then we also had what we called co-ops, or other people would call them guilds or chapters, where those folks came together who did the same thing and said, here's what I'm doing. We need to kind of connect these things together. And we were using Scrum. So we even, had this effort to have alignment with our customers and our community members. And one of the things I am the most proud of was that we had actual sprint reviews with actual community members every 2 weeks with every team. And
Yeah.
so we were not only continuing alignment, creating alignment, but checking it along the way. Um, so it was a lot easier to do that within the organization, and frankly, because I had some level of control of that, right?
Mhm.
Even though, we definitely checked in with teams about evolving that process. It wasn't like, you do what I say, but I had control over the conversations where I could ask them, hey, do you feel aligned? Do we have connection here? It is a lot harder with a board of directors who are not on the ground every day, who are not in the weeds every single day, and they have the best of intentions. But, you can make a statement as a member of a board of directors and have no idea the impact that that's actually going to have, or the ripple that it's going to have within the organization.
Yeah.
So that's when it gets hard.
Yeah. So this is our segue towards dealing with the board. You mentioned one of the challenges being creating alignment with that group of people and making sure that they understand to some extent the ripple effects of what they demand or ask for, or just even questions that they raise. Um, what were some other insights for you for the first time? You mentioned this, dealing with the board of directors from a CEO perspective. You yourself had been member of another board, which probably in terms of size was smaller than what we had at Scrum Alliance, and the organization was different. Dynamics could be very similar, but now you were in that CEO position, and you were a member of that board as the co-CEO, but you were also reporting to that board. You referred to us earlier as your bosses, right? When you would get that job. So, what were some of your most important insights in that particular case?
This is going to sound very political, but it's not. One was that everyone on that board at the time really did have the best of intentions. Like they cared about the organization and gave a lot of their time, especially during the pandemic. I mean, there's more asked of a board during crisis times than normal. Um, and again, I just have to reiterate that I cannot think of very many times that I came to the board with a crazy idea. And as long as I could justify it, as long as I could explain it and that there was thought behind it, that they didn't support me. So I will always be grateful for that. That said, I again was quite aware that there was distance. There was distance between the board and the staff. There was some distance, less so between the board and the community because we had community members that were on the board. Um, and I took very seriously. It was sort of, if you have like a campaign platform when you're interviewing to be a CEO, mine was I can connect these dots. I can bring together the staff, the community, the board, and us as the CEOs, and like I can connect it like a pipe, and like help us understand each other. And so, excuse me. So I was very aware of that distance, and that distance shows up in budgeting conversations. It shows up in strategic conversations. Um, there was also the distance between meetings. This is something that we as the co-CEOs were in every single day, Monday through Friday, sometimes on the weekends. This is something that the board members were, our meetings were quarterly, sometimes monthly during the pandemic, virtually. But all of these board members had day jobs, like they had other things that they were understandably concerned with. And so there was a little bit of this like sometimes having to kind of go, okay, last time we talked about XYZ. Here's what's happened since then. And it's just hard when there's not like a continuity for them the way that there was continuity for us. And I think in some of my work now, sorry to cut you off, but in some of my work now, when I work with other CEOs or other nonprofit, like executive directors, they experience some of the same things. And it's so interesting because the board is supposed to be separate to a degree for a reason, in order to be objective and to provide, skilled advice from a distance. But it also is just like it creates this sense of, yeah, but how can you give advice if you are not in this every day? Like if you don't understand what we're facing right now.
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned that distance piece, right? What were some very concrete challenges that resulted from that? If you're okay to talk about this, right? You just let me know as far as you want to go. We were both back then part of that organization, and but I think the learnings can be applicable in many other areas. That's why I'm interested in exploring it with you.
I'll share one. And again, I keep feeling the need to qualify this because I loved working with this board. I'm not just saying that. I actually loved board meetings, which I think made me weird. But I enjoyed them. I enjoyed like the learning and the talking about strategy, like all of it. I loved. I think the one thing where things got sticky was as we were entering the pandemic, or maybe in the first couple of months, there were a lot of budget conversations and there were a lot of organizations that were taking a stand and saying, we are not going to lay anyone off, no matter what it takes. We're going to find other creative ways. And that was my stance. I was not going to lay someone off and send them out into a job market where they had no hope at that point, which is weird to think about now. It's like flipped so quickly. Now like there's a fight for talent. But at the time, if you think about March to maybe June of 2020, And to be clear, no one on the board asked me to let anyone go. But I think because we weren't at that point, like, and for the record, for everyone to hear, we were never at that point. But there was a point of contention about the stand that I was taking,
Yeah,
that
I remember that.
I will find another way. So I don't even want it to be on the table. I do not want it to be a discussion. And I think part of it was just like the impression that I was being very stubborn, and I didn't care. I was like, yep, I am being stubborn. I'm not going to be responsible for, not arbitrarily, but even unarbitrarily sending people out into this place right now.
Mhm.
And so there were definitely, excuse me, there were definitely some discussions about, well, be realistic. And like, well, first of all, like, we're not there and we never got there. Um, we maintain our budget really well. We cut really well with expenses, and a lot of the things that we spent money on, like, our own gatherings or like contributing to other meetups in the world, weren't happening. So financially, we were okay. But it was the simple fact that I was like, I don't even want to talk about it. It's not on the table. And it's not because I'm soft, it's because I'm stubborn. And it's because I believe that there's a different way than, you know, what I've already said a couple times, which is, that just seems like the wrong thing to do right now. And so and part of that was because I am with these folks every single day. They are human people. I know they're kids, and I know their skills and their talent. And I know we're going to need that as soon as this thing is over.
Yeah. And
And
maybe
so,
even during this thing.
right. And so, I mean, that's one very distinct memory that I have where it's one of the only times that I felt like I actually like truly conflicted with a couple members of the board. And again, I don't actually think it was about the issue. I think it was the impression that I was being stubborn. And I wasn't usually stubborn. I think you would agree with me. I wasn't usually stubborn, but I was pretty stubborn
Agreed.
about this.
But you know what? Sorry for that. I didn't even take it as stubbornness back then. So here's my take on that. And I can confirm everything that you mentioned. Now, for me, it was about values. And values for me are always about priorities. So what I saw back then in you, and you and I had a lot of conversations around this being aligned. I saw very similar things in my dad because he would always, like, no matter what, like, it was not even on the table letting people go because he knew every single one of them. And he saw it as part of his responsibility. He does this until today to take care of these people, right? That being one core aspect of his role as the leader of a CEO. And not turning your back on people. This is now very harsh. The moment it becomes a bit rough, right? A good captain of a ship wouldn't do that. On the contrary, they would try to save every single life. Now, what I saw you doing back then, I didn't look at it as stubbornness. I looked at it and saw like someone is here that has really deep concern for the people she's responsible for. And maybe it was that distance that you talked about earlier that some of our fellow board members could not see that. And based on that, they not having the relationships, also not having the level of care for these people, and more looking at numbers than at humans, which resulted in that debate back then. So I didn't take it as stubbornness, but I think in tough times you really see what is the moral compass. And I'm not saying that certain morals are better than others, right? I have my opinion on that. But you really see in tough times how people prioritize and where and to what extent they actually mean what they say in good times. So after these experiences during the pandemic in my own company and what I saw at Scrum Alliance and at some other companies where I served as an advisor to the CEO, etc., I came up with this saying for myself, which was, your words don't matter if your actions and words are basically not aligned. Because you will always be judged by the people that you work for and the people that you lead by your actions. And if your actions and words are aligned, okay, then your words actually matter. But if not, You can say whatever you want. And I'm going to take the same example as you said, right? Kids are not going to do what you say, they're going to do what you do. Right? I've seen this with my three kids over and over again. And that's where I think part of this authenticity is actually being um, very much aligned with your own value system internally, being aware of that, not talking about stuff that you not really care about. So that was my take on that situation back then. And I think so. I always appreciated you taking that stand and looking for all the other options and not even being willing to discuss about this until you get there where you have to think about it. But as you mentioned, we never got there, fortunately.
I just have to add something funny that I don't think occurred to me until now. But when you were talking about values, I mean, many years ago, actually, when I was writing my application for my CEC, I kind of went through an exercise of determining my own values. And mine are courage, creativity, and empathy. And it's kind of funny in retrospect because, the empathy part is obvious, the courage part may be obvious, but the creativity part, to that point in my tenure at Scrum Alliance, nothing else I had done had been by the book, right? Like that was not how I wanted to operate. I wanted to try different things. So I'm not tooting my own horn, but like in retrospect, it's kind of humorous because basically this was the same thing. It was like, no, I'm not gonna. We see a couple other companies that are finding other ways. Let's find another way. Like let's be creative. And so it's kind of funny that like it should have been expected that I was not going to go straight to the easy, or not, it's not easy. Sorry, I take that back. But the obvious answer that I was like, what else can we do? Can we have a lemonade stand? Like, you know, excuse me.
No problem.
Um, but yeah, true. It's about values. And to your point about, um, you know, your actions and your words, I actually just wrote an article that just came out like a week ago about organizational gaslighting, about how, especially right now in this war for talent, people having a hard time recruiting and retaining people, organizations are going to use their culture as their differentiator.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that as long as your culture is real. But if you say in an interview process that, I always use self-organization as an example, that you believe in self-organization, but the minute someone actually gets into your organization and they find that they are being told exactly what to do and there is no self-organization, at first they're going to be like, oh, that's weird. I must have misinterpreted that. By the second or third time this happens, they're going to be like, am I,
In
like,
the
did I
right organization.
misunderstand something? Like, what's going on? And it's manipulation. I mean, it might be unintentional manipulation. I'm not necessarily saying that, organizations or leaders set out to be evil, but if you can't take a good hard look at what your values are and make sure that you are willing to uphold them personally as a
In
leader,
hard times. In hard times. That's always the point.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It starts with you, as the leader. And I was always like, I'm not saying I did it perfectly, but I was always very aware of that. Like, I can't expect other people to have courage if I can't demonstrate that myself and show them that it's okay on the other side of courage,
Yeah.
or, um, yeah, and a number of other, we're really big on our Scrum values at Scrum Alliance. And so I was always very aware, like, I cannot have an expectation of someone else to do something if I'm not willing to do it.
Yeah. No, I fully align with that. Now, you mentioned creativity as one of your core values. And we had one example of that, which was okay, what are going to be the options that we have when now we're in the middle of this pandemic or at the beginning of this pandemic and things are going to be probably very ugly. I want to explore with you some of the coolest things that you did during your time there.
Mhm.
Now, what are the things where you're like, hey, I'm incredibly proud because we tried something new here. And even if you took inspiration from other organizations, that's fine. But you were doing it for the first time in that particular organization. And I remember a few of those things where some of our board members are like, really? Are they going to do that? But I'd like to hear from you.
Oh, you're making me smile. So I mean, the first I mentioned, which was our structure, which, wasn't entirely original in the sense that there are definitely other organizations who had, um, kind of teams and guilds and chapters and whatnot. But I do think that some of the uniqueness was the true cross functionality of those teams. That, for the first time, marketers were working daily hand in hand with software developers. There was no handoff. It was okay, like we have a story, a user story that we are trying to accomplish as a team. And people had to learn skills for that. I mean, they had to learn how to speak up for their craft in their team, not wait to be asked for their opinion, but rather go, well, I'm part of this team and I know that, X, Y, and Z. And one of the coolest things about that was seeing the leadership in individuals start to rise up, and it didn't happen right away. They had to start to feel safe with their team. But some of these teams really, really gelled. And not all of them, but some of them. And we also, part of that was the persona based piece where in self organization, it is really easy to still sort of dictate to a team exactly what they should do, right? And it's like, oh, it's up to you, like how you cross your T's and dot your I's. What we did instead is said, you are responsible for a certain segment of this community. And with this segment, there are a set of products or certifications that you can use to serve them, but those are not the only things that you can or should be providing to them. You should be providing value in other ways. And so then we got really cool ideas that I'm not sure would have come up otherwise, because otherwise we would have just been product focused on only those certifications.
Yeah.
Um,
Just to jump in here, this persona-based cross-functional teams, that was something that was also to some extent new to me. Right? And I was like, we had some conversations around that,
mhm.
but I think it's interesting because what you do is you don't put a product into the center focus of these teams. They might even move away from a certain product because they see they can serve that particular persona, that member of the community, in a better shape or form doing something else. So you're
Exactly.
removing parts of the constraints that a lot of teams are facing. Now, for some teams, those product constraints might be the right ones at whatever stage they are. But in the case of that particular organization, that sounded to be like a really good idea. So sorry for interrupting you, but giving my perspective on that.
Yeah, no, no, and it was. I mean, it definitely. I mean, we didn't retire any major certifications, or I mean, there were value in those, and the team saw the value in those. But it did open up their creativity to go, okay, I just got this certification. What do I need now? What do I need next? To go serve the people in my organization. The other interesting thing is we had this concept of sister teams. So, these teams are basically along a journey, meaning like beginner, intermediate, advanced, essentially, but more than that. We also wanted to make sure that there was alignment between the teams that were sort of the closest in that journey so that we were one voice, right? And so you would have these teams that didn't do everything together, but the product owners were expected to have conversations. We also had a very common issue, which is that we couldn't fully staff every single team with every single role. But instead of having like a shared services team, we had this idea that if you had a role, and graphic designer was one that came up all the time. You
Mhm.
basically had a graphic designer per sister team pair.
Yeah.
Um, and what that meant was that that graphic designer could be on a team. So they had a team. They were not on both teams. This is my team. This is my home. But it is a shared understanding that when this other team needs me, that the POs are going to have a conversation, that I'm going to have a conversation with the teams, and I'm available to the other team. And it didn't always work perfectly, but I personally think it worked better than having, six
Shared
people
services. Mhm.
across like 8 teams. There was more clarity and more home again for those folks who may need to be shared across teams.
And more
Um,
depth. because they knew the context of that sister team much better.
Exactly, exactly. Like I'm not trying to go help 6 teams and trying to keep in my brain a shallow amount of information about all of them. So that was really interesting and seemed to work most of the time. There was still struggle and prioritization struggle. Um, so there was that. The other thing was our hiring events, which I was very proud of, and I still think are very fun and exciting. I borrowed sort of the core of that idea from Rich Sheridan, Joy Inc., and their idea of extreme interviewing. But essentially, sorry, um, we would, if we had a role that we needed to hire for, we would actually bring in all of the candidates for the role at the same time. And we would have them come in for what we called a day of play and conversation. And I'll say what started with one role, eventually we actually got to a point where we could do it with multiple roles in the same day, but I'll sort of get to that. But essentially, we would have them come in and just that, like we would play games, we would do lean coffee, we did speed interviewing, kind of like speed dating. And it was the only time, by the way, that speed interviewing when the resume came out. It was the only time because our belief was that we were hiring for what Rich calls in his book kindergarten skills. Scrum
Yeah, I
Alliance,
remember.
yeah, Scrum Alliance and Scrum anyway is like there's a lot to learn there for anyone. So we were much more concerned with not culture fit, but culture add and culture acceptance, kind of, because one of the biggest things I would tell people at the beginning of the day is we are weird. We are really weird here. And we want to make sure that we are the brand of weird that you will enjoy being around. And that includes a day of play because this is how we operate on a daily basis and we work as teams. And we use the empathy toy as an exercise where people would we would learn about communication and under stress and things like that. Um, and the entire intent for the day was to reduce the stress because when you reduce the stress for someone, then you actually get to see who they are. And so it was designed very intentionally from beginning to end to continuously like bring down the temperature and make sure people felt comfortable, not putting them on the spot. Like when we did lean coffee, they would do lean coffee as a co-op.
Mm.
And I always instructed our folks participate in the lean coffee. Do not put the candidates, or we call them guests, on the spot where they're the only ones talking. Like it will give them comfort if all of you are sort of interacting together.
And then
Um,
you can see how they build on top of what other people are saying and how they deal with maybe with conflicting ideas or perspectives. So you get also a different angle on the interviewing that person. Yeah.
exactly. And what I told them about the lean coffee was just pretend you're in co-op because this is what their co-ops look like every week,
Yeah.
and it gave the guests sort of a sense for, what does it feel like to be here every day? One of the coolest things about that I did not necessarily plan on is that the guests themselves almost always ended up connecting with each other. They would go to lunch because we would actually send them away for lunch and we would tell them ahead of time that we were going to so that we could have kind of a midday debrief. And so we would send them, off to a lunch hour and they would go together. These people that normally were competing for a job. And I will never forget in the first one that at the end of the day, there was like 20 minutes left. And I just leveled with all of the guests and I said, hey, this was our first time doing this. I would really love to hear your feedback about the day. I promise you it will not affect our decision whatsoever. But, how did this feel? Was this, you know, negative, positive, or whatever? And all of their feedback was largely positive. There were a couple of them that did say, hey, this part was a little awkward or whatever. But one guy stood up and said, I just have to say that in any other interview situation, if I didn't get the job, I would villainize the other people. Today, if I don't get this job, I'm going to understand why, because all 4 of these people are incredible. So Thank you for that, because now I'm not going to be upset no matter what happens. We did hire him, but not because of what he said.
Not because of that, yeah.
But that was like, again, not necessarily something that I planned for, but from that point on was something that we focused on. And we said, okay, how do we reduce the stress? How do we build community? How do we show them who we are and allow them to truly show us who they are? And the final, I think the very last one that were able to do before the pandemic hit was, I believe we hired 7 positions in one day by doing a massive hiring event. There were probably, if I had to remember correctly, there were probably 50 to 60 people in our office that day. And they were in different stations because they were there for different roles. It was a logistical nightmare. We did decide that we would never do it that way again because
Extreme interviewing, yeah.
it was too much. But literally at the end of that day, well, the very next day, we made 7 offers. There was not 6 interviews leading up to that. There was not like this long, drawn out process where everyone's lying. Let's just be honest. People lie in interviews in both directions. Rather, we had some fun, we learned some things, and then we were able to make offers. So um, I remember talking with uh, our key finance person when we were budgeting for the year, and it's not common to hire that many people at once. And I was like, we need to budget for it. Like, we need to budget that we're going to have all of these people hired by the end of the quarter. And she was kind of like,
That's not going to
okay,
happen.
all right. She's like, well, we'll budget for like 3. And if you go over, I'm sure the board will be happy that like got ahead of
Build
your
the positions, yeah.
And she absolutely afterwards was like, you did it. So that part was pretty fun.
Yeah,
I could talk
cool.
for like an entire episode just about hiring events. So you're going to have to tell me to shut up.
No, no, I think that's cool. You mentioned a few things that are really interesting. Now, uh, when I teach my agile leadership courses, one of the key topics that we dive into is about innovation. Right? Every organization is talking about we need to innovate, we need to innovate, and then you talk to them like, okay, what do you need to innovate on? And sometimes they talk about some processes that they want to make leaner and a bit better. Sometimes they talk about product innovation, like a new product they want to build. Some go a bit further and they talk about like a business model innovation, like ecosystems they want to build or new strategies. Very few talk about management innovation. And
Mhm.
the reason I asked you about the coolest thing that you have done was that I knew that you would come up with a ton of things that are part of management innovation, right? How you hire people, how you develop people, how you promote people. I remember you did a lot of work around the topic of compensations, right? How do you incentivize people? Yes, compensation is part of the incentivizing. It's not the only part, but it is an important part there. So a lot of these things are really things that leaders struggle to experiment on. And I was always um, fond of your curiosity to learn from other places and the courage to try to implement them within the organization. And I always believed it was our job as the board of directors to provide you that sandbox in which you can play. Because if we don't play, right, we're not going to see any meaningful difference going forward. Now, is everything going to work out? Definitely not. But the same applies to all other sorts of innovation. Even the process innovation, which is pretty straightforward. A lot of organizations get things wrong. But when it gets to management innovation, I think we have a lack of ambition in most organizations and in most leaders to really experiment on their own craft, on how their organization is structured, in order to achieve completely different outcomes than they're achieving today. But the coolest organizations, the one with a very unique culture, and you could like that culture, you could disagree with it, but it's still a very unique and authentic culture. They do have people that love these kind of experiments. So thanks for sharing that with us. Now, given the bit of time that we have still left, Melissa, I want to go into our last of these 4 topics, which is you were a coach, you became a co CEO, CEO, and now you're back into coaching. And in between, you had another position within an organization supporting their global like transformation, etc. But now you're a full-time coach again. You mentioned you're a keynote speaker, you're an executive coach, you support organizations also on transformation topics. What are the most important things from your time as an executive in the past 2, 3, 4 years that you now take into your daily coaching practice, which you wouldn't probably have done before you went into those positions?
So that moment that I described where my head was in my hands and I realized, like, oh my goodness, that has really informed the kind of coaching that I do now. And by that, I mean, if you were to go to my website and sort of, read some of my copy, what I talk about is that what we have to focus on is the relationship between leaders and employees. We don't need to focus on fixing leaders or fixing employees. And that relationship shows up in the form of employee experience. And by the way, a leader is also an employee. So what I do now is I work with leaders who recognize that, and we stop playing this blame game and we go, okay, what do we need to innovate on? What do we need to get curious about? I like how you said that. Um, in order to actually cultivate this relationship and this trust that needs to be there between the CEO or other, senior leaders and the team. And I'm not sure that that's the position or the perspective that I would have taken before. And frankly, I don't see that position or perspective taken by very many other coaches, because I've been on both sides of that coin.
Yeah.
One thing that was interesting is you mentioned that intermediary. I was a VP of agility for a company for a while, and I was I went from coach to CEO to employee. And that was a different experience after all of that. That was like, oh, wait, I'm responsible for people, but also this person, I have to be responsible to them and sort of follow that. And that was a different experience as well. And so to me, like being in that intermediary position was when I was like we have this wrong, where the employees are blaming the leaders and the leaders are blaming the employees. And it's this cycle that you can't get out of.
Mhm.
And so I think that's what changed me for the most part, is like having been in all of these seats now and going, okay, like Brene Brown talks about, when we're ready to give someone feedback, we have to be ready to sit next to them and put the problem on the table and not, point at them as if they are the problem. And that's sort of how I see this, is that we all have to be willing to sit together and go, we have a trust problem. Why do we have a trust problem? And it's probably, there's a little bit of
Okay.
everyone's fault
Mhm.
in it and no one's fault.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's very important. So this is something that I have been curious about, but also struggling with for a long time, given how long I've been involved in the Agile community and with many, many of the coaches whom I dearly respect. But I always could tell who was a coach who had been a leader before and who was a coach who had never been a leader before, based on the level of empathy, the level of realism, the creativity in terms of coming up with solutions and all of that. And I saw that development in you over. But and to be honest, I mean, you didn't come in as a coach who had never been a leader before, because even before Scrum Alliance, you've had leadership positions. But I think you matured a lot in that and in that position. You just got a lot of experience. You got your hands dirty, right? Being in there and not just being a distant observer and maybe advisor. And I think for me at least, and I know people have a lot of different opinions out there. We just had this tweet by Elon Musk going out that he believes a leader of software engineers needs to be a great software engineer himself. And to some extent, I think that's right. Maybe again, I'm shaped by my background as a medical doctor, where the leaders of medical doctors are more experienced medical doctors, and that's how you learn, that's how you're trained. But I do think that in every type of work that we do, it's great, or I always appreciated working for people when I was an employee, when I was reporting to someone, if that person really had experience. This didn't mean that they have answers to every question that I have, but just knowing that they had been into a lot of these situations gave me comfort as an employee, both to ask questions, but also to ask for forgiveness when I had done something on my own and maybe messed up. So that was always fun, and I think I would encourage more coaches to go out there and really take leadership positions, and not just. And by that I don't mean being the CEO of a one-person company, because that's what we also see in many people. Yeah, Melissa, thank you. The time flew by. Was a wonderful conversation as always. I deeply appreciate you sharing so openly. And you and I, we can talk for hours. And the next time we'll meet on your podcast, I had to reschedule the last time. So it's just rescheduling, not declining. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you for this and for this journey. We were definitely on it together.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.